There was a fairly intense thunderstorm that night in Portland. Nothing life-threatening, just enough heavy rain and flashes of lightning to make everyone stay indoors. I've always enjoyed stormy nights. There's something about the sound of rain hitting the roof, mixed with distant rumbles of thunder, that makes me feel cozy and calm. Since I didn't have work the next morning, I decided to take advantage of the evening. By 8 p.m., I brewed a hot cup of coffee and settled on a couch, ready for a long, relaxing night of movies and rain watching. I put on a film and sank into the cushions, feeling perfectly content. About 20 minutes into the movie, my phone rang. I glanced at the number, unfamiliar, but with a local area code. Thinking it might be important, I answered. "Hello?" I said. Silence. "Hello? Can I help you?" Still nothing. Oddly, I could hear faint background noise. Static, perhaps. Or maybe the rain outside. It sounded messy, chaotic, but unmistakably real. After a few seconds of listening, I hung up, shaking my head. Must have been a wrong number, or maybe some kind of scam. I set the phone on the table and returned to my movie. About an hour in, the storm intensified. Thunder shook the walls, lightning lit up the sky, and heavy rain pounded the windows. Then, both the lights and TV flickered violently before going completely out. The house fell silent, leaving only the storm roaring outside. I lit a candle, the only source of light, and decided to check the breaker downstairs. The switch was loose. I flipped it, but nothing happened. I went back upstairs and watched the storm through the window, noticing that the neighboring houses were dark too. This was a significant outage. My phone, running on 5G, had no updates about the blackout. After about 15 minutes, I heard a sudden sound outside. The backyard gate swung open. It had no lock, but it never moved like that on its own. I cautiously went to the back door, and through the shadows and rain, saw the silhouette of a man. He stood in the yard, completely still, just a dark figure in the storm. I couldn't tell which way he was facing. He didn't move for a full minute, then slowly raised an arm, holding a faint, glowing light. Before I could process it, my phone rang again from the same unknown number. That's when it hit me. The man outside had called me before, the first time when nothing was said on the line. How long had he been standing there in the rain? Heart racing, I grabbed my phone, but by the time I returned to the door, the man was gone. Moments later, the phone rang again. I declined. Then, a series of aggressive knocks came at the front door, synchronized with the ringing. Heavy, shaking knocks. I froze, unsure what to do. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I called the police. They arrived within minutes, chasing the intruder into the storm. He got away, and the investigation found nothing but a dead-end phone number. I never saw him again. This happened one summer when I was around 12 years old. My parents had left for a short trip 8 hours away, and I had the house to myself. I invited my best friend Ryan over under the pretense that his parents didn't know I'd be home alone. He arrived around 6 in the evening. We played video games for hours. Around 11:30 p.m., Ryan went to the bathroom, and within 30 seconds, he returned and asked if I heard something. Before he could explain, the house went dark. The TV, Xbox, lights, all off. Using my phone's flashlight, we cautiously moved through the house to investigate. We went down to the basement, where the breaker box was located. The door was already open, which was unusual. I followed Ryan down the creaky stairs, the flashlight illuminating stacks of old boxes and unused items. The main switch was flipped opposite the others. Ryan hesitated, then flipped it back. The power briefly flickered in the house, appliances making startup noises, but the basement remained dark. Suddenly, a shuffling sound came from the far end. A tall, skinny figure with long, dark hair appeared, partially hidden behind boxes. I didn't wait. We sprinted upstairs, slammed the basement door, and ran out the front, calling 911. As we watched, the figure moved past downstairs windows, then upstairs, before disappearing entirely. The police found nothing inside, and the intruder was never identified. Even now, thinking back on that night gives me chills. The experience was terrifying, yet surreal, something you think only happens in movies. My parents eventually moved us out of that house, and I've never returned. It was the summer of 2017 when I finally had the house all to myself. My parents had left early Saturday morning for a short road trip to New Orleans, retracing a part of their honeymoon. I didn't really care about the details. They were gone, and I could have the house alone for the weekend. I immediately texted my best friend, Ethan. Normally, his parents wouldn't have let him come over without any adults in the house, but a few careful white lies later, he was on his way. He wasn't supposed to arrive until around 6 p.m., but I was too excited to wait. I opened the front windows to see when he got there. That's when I noticed him, a man standing unusually close to the house, just past a sidewalk near the garage. He had long, unkempt dark hair, a patchy beard, and was tall and skinny. Something about him immediately made me uneasy, so I stepped back from the window, trying not to be seen. A few minutes later, I checked again, and he was gone. I didn't think much of it and went about my day. The rest of the afternoon was calm. I played video games in my room until Ethan arrived around 6 p.m. We grabbed snacks from the kitchen, then locked ourselves in my room for a 5-hour gaming marathon. Around 11:30 p.m., Ethan left the room to use the bathroom. Only 30 seconds later, he came back asking if I had heard something. I hadn't, but before he could explain, everything went dark. The TV, lights, Xbox, everything shut off instantly. I couldn't even see Ethan standing a few feet away. I groped along the floor, found my phone, and turned on the flashlight. Both of us stood there, frozen for a moment, trying to make sense of the sudden blackout. Eventually, I asked Ethan again what he had heard. He said he wasn't sure. Maybe a thump or footsteps on the floor below. The power being out made it even more unsettling. We cautiously headed to the hallway and down to the first floor. We could hear the wind outside, but it seemed normal. Still, we knew we needed to figure out what had happened. I remembered the electrical box in the basement and led Ethan down there. Oddly, the basement door was already open. Rarely anyone went down there. It was mostly unfinished storage. With my parents gone, I assumed maybe they had gone down earlier, but it still felt strange. We descended the creaky wooden stairs, our phone flashlights guiding the way. The basement was dark, cold, and narrow, with a few scattered boxes and random items against the concrete walls. The electrical panel was partially open. Ethan hesitated, but eventually flipped the main switch. Immediately, faint beeps and appliance startup noises came from upstairs. The basement remained dark, lit only by the dim light from the first floor. Just as we were about to head back upstairs, a shuffling sound echoed from the far side of the basement. I shined the flashlight and froze. In the shadows, I saw him, the tall, skinny man with long, dark hair, partially hidden behind boxes. I couldn't tell if he was looking at us. Panic surged, and I bolted upstairs, Ethan right behind me. We slammed the basement door and ran straight out the front door. Outside, we immediately called 911. From our vantage point, all the other houses had lights, making it obvious the man had shut off the power. While I was on the phone with the operator, we saw a figure move past a downstairs window, then 15 seconds later past an upstairs window, likely my parents' room. Minutes later, police arrived. They searched the house and found nothing. He had already escaped out a back window. The questions my parents had when they returned were endless, but ultimately, nothing came of it. The terrifying part wasn't just the break-in. It was the thought of how long he had been watching the house, planning his moves and remaining hidden in the basement. Soon after, my parents moved us out of that house. I never had another encounter with that man, but the memory of that night has never left me. It was late October 2019, and I decided to take a short break from work to visit my off-grid cabin in the remote forests of northern Montana. I had been looking forward to this for months. The cabin was completely isolated, perfect for escaping the city and enjoying complete solitude. I left early Friday morning, planning a 3-day weekend. I didn't sleep much the night before, so the 3-hour drive through winding, narrow dirt roads was exhausting. By the time I reached the cabin around 7 p.m., the sun had set and darkness enveloped the forest. I parked, unloaded my bag, and went around to start the generator. The cabin ran entirely off of a small gas-powered generator that supplied electricity to the lights, outlets, and even the electric stove. I filled it with gas, cranked it up, and headed inside to start the wood stove. Fall nights in northern Montana were bitterly cold, and it would easily dip below 25 degrees Fahrenheit. I stayed up for about an hour, letting the warmth settle in before heading to bed. The next morning, I spent most of the day cleaning and dusting, sealing cracks in the cabin walls to prepare for the winter. Around midday, I noticed an old pickup truck slowly approaching along a dirt trail. They drove between the trees, but stopped just out of sight for about 5 minutes before turning around and leaving. I assumed they had taken a wrong turn, perhaps heading to a neighboring cabin, and didn't think much more of it. By 10 p.m., I wanted to enjoy the night air and started a small campfire on the front porch. I tossed some logs into the fire pit and lit it, enjoying the warm glow and quiet of the surrounding forest. But after only a few minutes, the outdoor porch light went out. Glancing back at the cabin, I realized all the lights were off, except for the dim glow of the wood stove. Confused, I checked the generator and discovered it had shut off. I tried restarting it multiple times, but it wouldn't turn on. Frustrated, I walked around the cabin to inspect it and discovered the gas tank was completely empty. That made no sense. I had filled it completely the night before. I checked for leaks, but found none. I would have to wait until morning to get more fuel. I sat back down on the porch, trying to calm myself and enjoy the remaining night. It wasn't long before I noticed something in the woods, a dark shape, still and motionless, just off the dirt trail. At first I thought it might be a tree or bush, but the form was too defined, and it didn't move at all. A few minutes later, when I glanced back, the figure had disappeared. My unease grew, and I didn't take my eyes off the forest for the next half hour. Around midnight, I heard a sudden crack to my left, like a branch snapping or something falling. I froze and scanned the darkness. Then, to my horror, the original figure reappeared, along with another and another. Within moments, about a dozen dark figures were standing motionless among the trees, all facing the cabin. Panic set in. I ran inside, slamming the door behind me and holding my breath, debating whether to peek through the windows. Eventually, I mustered the courage to glance outside. The forest was empty. Every single figure had vanished. Relief was fleeting, as moments later I heard footsteps circling the cabin. I could distinctly hear 4 or 5 sets, though there may have been more. They moved slowly, in unison, approaching the front porch. My heart raced. The steps paused directly outside the door. Whoever these people were, they made no noise besides the sound of their boots on the wooden porch. They moved with precision, like they had a plan. I couldn't understand why a group like this would be out here in the middle of nowhere. Minutes passed, and I knew they were just waiting for me to make a move. After about 10 minutes, I decided to take a risk. I carefully cracked the blinds, just enough to peek through one eye. The porch was empty. The group had disappeared without a sound. I didn't grab anything besides my car keys and ran to my vehicle, speeding away from the cabin. I expected them to be somewhere along the narrow dirt road, but the forest was empty. I still have no explanation for what I experienced that night. How did so many people sneak into the woods, drain my generator, and vanish without leaving a trace? What were they planning? I haven't returned to the cabin since, though I know I eventually will, and the thought terrifies me. This happened when I was in my early 20s. Back then, I was living in a small house with 3 other guys. None of us really knew each other before moving in, but we had all gone to the same college and graduated together. So, when it came time to find a place to live, everything just kind of fell into place. We split the rent 4 ways, which allowed us to afford a modest house on the outskirts of the city. Anything closer in town was way too expensive. For the first 9 months, everything went smoothly. But then, out of nowhere, 2 of the guys decided to move out, leaving only me and Alex. Unfortunately, Alex was the one roommate I barely knew. He was always busy with work, coming home late, or simply avoiding hanging out with the rest of us. It was frustrating that the 2 who left were the ones I actually got along with. On top of that, splitting rent between just the 2 of us meant paying double each, which we couldn't sustain. So we agreed that at the end of the lease, in 3 months, we would part ways. The first month after the 2 left, Alex's absence became very noticeable. On my days off, I was usually alone at home all day and night, which was a stark contrast to when the other 2 guys were around. I didn't mind too much. In fact, having the house to myself was nice, but it was strange that Alex was gone so often. He only worked part-time in the mornings, so I assumed he must have been out with friends every night. One night, I stayed up later than usual. Around 1 a.m., I saw headlights moving down the graveled driveway and heard the front door open. On a whim, I decided to say hi, just to keep things from feeling too distant. I opened my bedroom door and immediately noticed Alex's footsteps rushing down the hallway. When I peeked out, he jumped as if I had caught him in the middle of something. The hallway lights were off, so I couldn't see him clearly, but his eyes were wide, and his body froze just outside his bedroom door. "Hey, Alex, what's up?" "Just checking how you're doing," I said, trying to break the silence. He just stood there in the dark with wide eyes, staring at me. It was unnerving. "I'm good," he muttered. A few seconds of silence passed, and I nodded, retreating to my room. That didn't make things any less awkward. Why was he acting so strange, hurrying to his room like that? I didn't want to pry, but I was concerned. A couple minutes later, I quietly left my room and walked down the hallway to listen near his door. I heard him moving around frantically, opening and closing drawers. The chaos made me uneasy. Then suddenly, everything went quiet, like he had frozen in place. My nerves were on edge, and before I could move, the door swung open. Alex stood there, wide-eyed, staring at me. "I'm just heading to the kitchen." "Want anything?" I asked, trying to cover my nervousness. He whispered no and closed the door. It was unsettling. I went to the kitchen, then back to my room. He stayed quiet the rest of the night. For the next 5 or 6 days, I became hyper-aware of his behavior. I stayed up until he got home, feeling too uncomfortable to sleep until he was in his room. His strange, almost zombie-like demeanor continued. His eyes looked restless every day, and he barely spoke, always rushing back to his room. One night, as I was in bed trying to sleep, there was a knock on my door. I was startled. I hadn't heard him walk down the hallway. When I opened it, he had the same restless eyes and a half-smile. He said he had dropped his wallet somewhere on the driveway and asked if I had a flashlight to help him find it. It struck me as odd. He never asked for help before. Tired, but wanting to ease the tension, I grabbed a flashlight and followed him outside. He started small talk about work while we walked on the gravel. His car, I noticed, was parked unusually far down the driveway. As we walked, Alex led me deeper into the woods. Every time I suggested turning back, he insisted we go further. My nerves were on edge. "Here, you can take the flashlight. I'll head back. I got work early," I said, trying to leave. He didn't take it. His fake smile faded, and his eyes looked angry. I quickly walked back to the house, glancing back to see him standing there, watching me. Once inside, I packed my things. I didn't sleep all night, listening to make sure he wasn't up to anything else. He never returned that night. The next morning, I loaded my car and left. Even years later, I never heard from Alex again, and I never figured out what he was planning that night in the woods. His behavior was not normal, and I genuinely think he intended something horrible. When I was 25, I lived with my college roommate, Ryan, in a small house near the campus we had both attended. Even though we had been roommates for a year in college, we weren't particularly close. Moving in together after graduation made sense, since we had similar plans and needed a place to live temporarily. The first year went smoothly. We got along better than expected and decided to renew the lease for another year. This story happened in August, 2 months after renewing the lease. One night, after finishing work late, I came home and chatted with Ryan for a bit. Then we both went to bed. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of floorboards creaking in the hallway. Someone was walking slowly toward the main area of the house. I rolled over, checked the clock. It was 3 a.m., and assumed Ryan had gotten up for a glass of water. I didn't think much of it and went back to sleep. The next morning, I left for work early. As I was rushing out, Ryan, looking tired, asked me a strange question. "Were you walking around the house last night?" I was shocked. I told him I hadn't, though I thought I had heard him moving. The conversation ended there, both of us confused, and I left for work. I figured the noises must have been the house settling or wind against the walls. That night, I returned home around the same time as the previous night. Ryan was at work, so I spent the evening in my room. Around the same time as before, I went to bed. But again, I woke to the same sound, floorboards creaking, as if someone was walking slowly through the hallway and into the living room. I got up to check, but Ryan wasn't there, and nothing seemed out of place. I returned to bed, but the strange thing was that the sound moved through the house, like it was following a person. I mentioned it to Ryan the next morning, but neither of us could explain it. That day, Ryan had the day off, but I had to go to work at 2 p.m. I didn't return until nearly 11 p.m. When I arrived, I noticed Ryan still awake, sitting in the corner of his bedroom. As I walked past, I called out, "Hey, what's up?" But he didn't respond, thinking maybe he hadn't heard me. I went to my room, changed, and headed to the kitchen for a snack. As I passed by Ryan's room, his light was off. I peeked inside. He was still sitting on his bed, barely visible in the dark. "You okay, Ryan?" I asked. No response. I left him alone and spent about 15 minutes in the kitchen, then returned to my room. Around 1 a.m. I heard the floorboards creak again in the hallway. Something moved under Ryan's door. I decided to text him this time. "Was that you walking around?" After a few minutes, he replied with a question mark. Then, "What do you mean?" "I'm not home right now." My face went pale. I ran into the hallway. No one was there, but Ryan's bedroom door was now wide open. I carefully looked inside and froze. Standing in the center of the dark room was a man I didn't recognize. Even in the shadows, I could tell he was taller than Ryan, with a thick beard. I didn't hesitate. I ran out of the house and called the police from across the street. By the time they arrived, the man was gone. Strangely, there were no signs of forced entry or exit, except for a window that had been left slightly unlocked, though it didn't appear to have been used recently. The scariest part, whoever this man was, he had been moving around the house at night while we were asleep, and he had even been sitting on Ryan's bed. Ryan had the day off, meaning he would have been alone most of the evening. I'm convinced this intruder had been waiting for the right opportunity to catch Ryan off guard. In 2016, when I was 23, I decided to use an online classified site to find a roommate for my apartment. Back then, it was normal to use these sites to find people to share rent with. There weren't many alternatives, and it wasn't as widely exploited as today. I posted an ad with some photos of my apartment and mentioned that I preferred someone around my age. Within a few days, I got a response from a woman named Emily. She said she was 23 as well and still in college. From our conversations on the phone, she seemed pretty similar to me, and I thought we could be good roommates. I scheduled a time for her to come see the apartment. When Emily arrived, everything seemed fine. She liked the apartment. We agreed on a price, and within a week, she had moved in. I did notice something slightly unusual. She looked a bit older than her age, taller than me, with a mature presence. But I thought nothing of it. The first few days went by quickly. We both had busy schedules, with me working and her attending college and work. On the 5th day after she moved in, I got home around 10 p.m. and immediately heard footsteps rushing down the hallway, followed by a door slamming. Confused, I dropped my bag and checked the hallway leading to our bedrooms. Her door was closed, the light on, and my door was open. I was sure I had locked it before leaving, so this felt strange. I closed my door, checked my room, and nothing seemed out of place. I told myself it was nothing and tried to settle in for the night, watching TV in my room. For about an hour, I didn't hear a thing from Emily. I assumed she was sleeping since she liked to go to bed early. Then, out of habit, I glanced at my bedroom door and noticed a shadow beneath the crack. Emily was standing there, not moving. How long had she been there? I called out softly, "Emily?" She didn't respond. Seconds felt like minutes as the shadow remained still. Then, slowly, she moved away from the door and walked down the hallway. I heard her bedroom door slam shut behind her. My heart raced. The next morning, I casually asked her if she needed anything. She smiled and said everything was fine, ending the conversation. It felt odd, but I didn't press further. Life continued as usual, and she left for the day. I went to work, returning around 10:30 p.m. The apartment was dark and quiet. I went to my room, locked the door, and started winding down. During my shower, I thought I heard something near my room. I paused to listen, but heard nothing else, continuing with my routine. When I stepped out, I noticed my bedroom door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it this time. I quickly got dressed and looked down the hallway. The apartment was silent, dark. Emily's room was dark too, yet I could see her figure in the corner near my wardrobe. She didn't move or to speak, just stared at me. My heart pounded as I watched her step closer, her blank stare piercing through the darkness. Suddenly, she ran across the room into the hallway. A second later, her bedroom door slammed shut. Terrified, I grabbed my phone and car keys and ran out of the building. I didn't even want to stay in the parking lot, worried she might come after me. I drove to a nearby neighborhood, parked, and called the police. By the time they arrived, Emily was gone. Most of her belongings were missing, and it was clear she had fabricated her identity. Her name didn't match her real identity, and the phone she had given me was a prepaid burner with no traceable information. It was 2016, and even now, years later, I've never heard from her again. I believe she had disturbing intentions and was never truly my roommate. After that, I moved apartments, constantly worried that she might return unexpectedly. This happened when I was 24, back in the summer of 2017. I was living in a small house just outside the outskirts of Portland, Maine, with 3 other guys. None of us really knew each other before moving in. But we had all graduated from the same university at the same time. After graduation, all of us were looking for a place to live, and somehow it just worked out. Splitting the rent 4 ways, we could afford a modest house a little away from the city, which worked perfectly since anything closer was way too expensive. For the first 9 months, everything was fine. We all got along decently enough, though we weren't particularly close. Then, out of nowhere, 2 of the guys decided to move out. That left just me and Liam, who had always been the quiet one among us. To be honest, I hadn't really talked to him much because he was always working late or staying out and rarely hung out with the rest of us. Suddenly, I was stuck paying double the rent, which wasn't sustainable. So we agreed that when the lease ended in 3 months, we would part ways and leave the house. The first month after the 2 moved out made it painfully clear how absent Liam was most of the time. My days off were spent alone, which was completely different from before. Initially, I didn't mind. In fact, having the house to myself was kind of nice. But his constant absence felt strange, especially since he only worked part-time in the mornings. I assumed he must be out with friends every night. One night, I stayed up later than usual. Around 1 a.m., I saw headlights flash through my window as a car pulled down the graveled driveway. At that moment, I heard the front door open. I got up and, almost out of instinct, decided to greet him to keep things from feeling distant or awkward. I opened my bedroom door, and that's when I heard his footsteps rushing down the hallway. When I peeked out, Liam froze in place just outside his bedroom door, his eyes wide in the darkness. The hallway light was off, so I couldn't see him clearly, but that stare alone was enough to make me uneasy. "Hey, Liam, how's it going?" I said, trying to sound casual. He just stood there for a few seconds and then muttered, "I'm good." The silence that followed made everything feel even stranger. I nodded and stepped back into my room, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. After a few minutes, curiosity got the better of me. I quietly walked down the hallway, trying to listen as I passed his room. That's when I heard it, scrambling noises like someone frantically opening and closing drawers. My stomach sank, and I leaned closer to listen. Suddenly, everything stopped. The silence was suffocating. Then, the door swung open, and there he was, staring at me with those same wide eyes. Trying to cover my own unease, I said, "I'm just heading to the kitchen. Want anything?" He murmured, "No," and closed the door. That night, he remained silent, and for the next 5 or 6 days I became hyper-aware of his movements. He continued his strange, almost zombie-like behavior. His eyes grew more restless each day, and he spoke almost nothing, hurrying to his room every time he came home. One night, after he returned and I was trying to sleep, there was a knock at my door. It startled me. I hadn't heard him walk down the hallway. I opened the door to find him standing there with that same unsettling look and a faint, partial smile. He claimed he thought he'd dropped his wallet in the driveway and asked if I had a flashlight to help him. Feeling uneasy but hoping to smooth things over, I grabbed a flashlight and followed him. We walked toward the end of the driveway, and his car was parked far away for no apparent reason. He kept trying to lead me deeper into the woods, claiming he might have dropped it there, but I didn't believe him. My instinct screamed that something was wrong. "Here, you take the flashlight. I need to head back. Early work tomorrow," I said, trying to extricate myself. He didn't take it. His fake smile disappeared, and his restless eyes became angry. I turned and walked quickly back to the house, glancing back to see him standing there, watching. Once inside, I started packing my essentials and left the house that very night. Even years later, I never heard from him or found out what his intentions were. His behavior was far from normal, and I honestly think he might have been planning something terrible in those woods that night. This happened in the spring of 2018. I was 25 at the time, and I decided to move in with my college roommate, Ethan, into a small house just outside of a university campus in upstate New York. Even though we had lived together for a year during college, we weren't exactly close friends. We just shared similar plans after graduation, so moving in together made sense at the time. The first year went smoothly. We got along better than I expected, and even decided to renew the lease for another year. Everything seemed normal until one night in June, about 2 months after renewing the lease. I had gotten home from work late, and Ethan and I talked for a little while before calling it a night and going to bed. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the floorboards creaking in the hallway. I assumed Ethan was just getting a glass of water, so I ignored it and tried to go back to sleep. In the morning, as I was rushing to leave for work, Ethan opened his bedroom door, looking tired, and asked something that caught me off guard. "Why were you walking around the house last night?" I froze for a moment, confused. I explained that I hadn't been up and assumed I heard him moving. We both shrugged it off, and I left for work. At the time, I figured it was just the house creaking or something from the wind outside. When I returned that night, Ethan was at work, so I spent the evening alone in my room. Around the same time as the previous night, I heard the same creaking again. This time, I paid closer attention. It sounded exactly like someone walking slowly through the hallway into the living room, and then pausing for a moment. I got up to check, but Ethan wasn't there, and nothing seemed out of place. What made it even stranger was the way the sound moved through the house, like someone was deliberately walking from room to room. I mentioned it to Ethan the next morning, but neither of us could explain it. That afternoon, I returned home around 11 p.m. after work. I was surprised to see Ethan still awake in his room. As I passed his doorway, I called out, "Hey, what's up?" But he didn't respond. I thought maybe he hadn't heard me, so I went into my room to change. Afterwards, I went to the kitchen to get a snack. Ethan's room was dark now, but when I glanced in, I saw him still sitting on his bed in a corner, motionless. "Ethan, you okay?" I asked. He didn't respond. I decided to leave him be and went about my evening. An hour later, I heard the floorboards creaking again in the hallway. Something moved under Ethan's door. I grabbed my phone to text him, but the reply I got made my blood run cold. He responded with a single question mark, then followed up. "What do you mean?" "I'm not home right now," I froze. I ran to the hallway and checked. No one was there. But Ethan's bedroom door was now open, and standing in the center of the pitch-black room was a man. Even in the dark, I could tell he was tall, with a thick beard, and completely different from Ethan. In his hand, I noticed a small glint, the reflection of a pocket knife, catching the faint light. I didn't hesitate. I ran out of the house and called the police from across the street. By the time they arrived, the man was gone. There were no signs of forced entry, besides a partially unlocked window that didn't seem to have been recently opened. It was terrifying to realize that the person had likely been inside the house for days, moving around while we slept, and had waited for the right moment when Ethan was alone. That day, Ethan had been off from work while I had been at the house. Perfect timing for whoever this was. I shudder to think what might have happened if I had been alone. From that day on, I never fully trusted the safety of the house again. I changed my locks, installed extra security measures, and never spent another night alone in that house. It's one of those experiences that stays with you, leaving a deep sense of unease about how someone could be so close and unnoticed for so long. This happened in March 2020. I was 25 years old and had just moved into a small apartment in Portland, Maine. I found a roommate through an online listing, a guy named Ethan. We had been acquaintances at college, but weren't particularly close. Still, we had similar schedules and figured living together would be easier for both of us. The first few months went fine. We got along well enough, kept the apartment relatively tidy, and shared basic household responsibilities. Then, one night in mid-March, after a long shift at work, I came home around 11 p.m. I said hi to Ethan briefly, then went to bed as usual. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps creaking across the hallway outside my room. At first, I assumed it was Ethan getting a drink or using the bathroom. I rolled over and tried to go back to sleep, but the sound persisted, moving closer to my door and then stopping. The next morning, I mentioned it to Ethan. He looked surprised. "What are you talking about?" "I didn't get up all night," he said. I shrugged it off, thinking it might have been a dream or the apartment settling. That night, I went to bed around the same time, again around 3 a.m. The same slow creaking footsteps woke me. This time, I sat up and listened carefully. The sound moved down the hall and into the living room, just like the night before. I quietly got out of bed and peeked into the hallway. No one was there. I checked the living room, empty. Confused, I returned to my room and locked the door. A few hours later, I heard a faint scratching at the door. I froze. Slowly, I turned on my bedside lamp. There was nothing visible outside the door, but the scratching continued intermittently. Like someone trying to find a way in, I texted Ethan in a panic. "Are you even here?" "Someone's at my door." He replied, "I'm at work. I've been gone all night." My heart sank. Whoever it was, they had been inside the apartment while I slept. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching a baseball bat I kept under my bed. Every sound, the creaking floors, the occasional soft tap, made my pulse spike. The next morning, I called the police. They arrived, checked the apartment thoroughly, but found no signs of forced entry except a slightly ajar window in the living room. No fingerprints, no footprints, nothing. I moved out immediately after that incident. I never saw anyone again, and Ethan claimed he never experienced anything like it. Looking back, I still get chills imagining that someone had been walking around my apartment while I slept, waiting for the right moment. To this day, I make sure all my windows are locked. and I never ignore strange noises at night. That experience taught me a harsh lesson. Sometimes the danger is closer than you think, even in the safety of your own home. It was the summer of 2016. I was 24 years old and had decided to visit my family in upstate New Hampshire for a few weeks. While I was there, I wanted to go camping because my parents' house sat just on the edge of the White Mountains. Back when I still lived with them, I used to explore the trails all the time, but since moving out, I hadn't gone hiking or camping even once. There was one trail that had been on my mind for months. Before I moved, I stumbled across a post on an online forum for people who explored abandoned buildings. The post mentioned an old hunting lodge deep in the forest, and I had been wanting to see it ever since. So, on a Monday morning, I drove out to the trailhead. I parked along a quiet side road, and the trail wasn't marked. It was clear that it was just a rough path carved out by explorers like me. The vegetation had overtaken much of it, making it seem like nobody had walked there in years. The hike to the lodge took just under 2 hours. The path was mostly flat, but it was challenging because weeds and brush had grown thickly over it. Still, I eventually made it. My plan was to camp inside the lodge because, honestly, why not? But I came prepared with a tent just in case it was unsafe. And it was. From the outside, the lodge was falling apart. Most of the roof had collapsed. The wooden beams were rotting, and mold covered large sections. The front door, however, was wide open. I peeked inside, curious. The smell of decay hit me immediately, and the interior was a mess of broken furniture and fallen beams. At the far end of the main hallway, there was a door that looked intact. I tried to reach it, but the floorboards and debris made it too dangerous, so I backed out. With nothing else planned, I started searching for a place to set up camp. It was getting late, and options were scarce. So I walked about 200 feet away from the lodge, cleared a small area, and pitched my tent. As the sun set, darkness swallowed the lodge, and the forest came alive with the sounds of crickets. I tried to stargaze, but tall trees and some cloud cover blocked most of the sky. I sat near a small campfire, tossing sticks into the flames, letting my thoughts wander, until I heard a noise. It was sudden and sharp, like wood bending or snapping. Even though I couldn't see the lodge from my tent, the sound had come from its direction. It lasted only a few seconds, but it sent chills down my spine. Maybe it was just the old wood creaking in the wind. Maybe it was something else. I sat for about 30 minutes, listening for more, but nothing came. It was still early in the night, and I knew if I didn't check the lodge now, I wouldn't sleep. I stoked the fire with more sticks and grabbed my small LED flashlight, heading toward the lodge. After a minute of walking, the silhouette of the lodge appeared in the beam of light. As expected, it was eerie. I approached cautiously, passing broken windows, and shone my light inside. Darkness enveloped the lodge, and visibility was minimal. When I reached the door, I froze. It was closed. I had left it wide open just 2 hours ago. Then I noticed scratches along the door, jagged marks that could have been made by nails or a knife. I wasn't sure if they had been there before, or if they were responsible for the noise I heard. I debated opening the door, but decided against it. Whatever or whoever was inside, I didn't want to find out. I hurried back to my campsite, but something felt wrong. The forest around me was pitch black. Only my lantern illuminated the area. I made it back to my tent. Smoke curled from the fire as though it had been abruptly extinguished while still burning. I called out, "Hello? Who's out there?" No response. A chill ran down my spine. I knew the hike back to my car was 2 hours, so I quickly packed up. As I stuffed the last of my gear into my backpack, I heard a soft laugh from the trees. It was quiet, single, and uncomfortably close, like someone was watching me. I didn't stop. I sprinted down the trail, struggling to see in the dark. Several times I thought I heard the laugh again, blending perfectly with the night. Finally, I reached the road, jumped into my car, and drove away. Even 7 years later, I still consider this the most disturbing experience of my life. Being alone in the forest at night, stalked by someone or something, was a helplessness I can never forget. It was the summer of 2022. I was 25 and had decided to take a solo backpacking trip through the Cascade Mountains in Washington. I wanted a place far away from everyone, somewhere I could disconnect completely. I had been hiking and camping in these mountains before, but this trail led to a spot I'd only read about in an old forum dedicated to wilderness explorers. According to the posts, it was a remote clearing surrounded by dense forest where no one ever went. A perfect place to camp without interruption. I started the hike early in the morning, carrying only the essentials: my backpack, a tent, some food, and my dog, Max. Max is a border collie, medium-sized, very smart, and extremely loyal. He's always with me on my trips, running around and exploring, but he's also cautious, and I trust his instincts more than my own in the wild. The trail was rougher than I remembered from previous visits. Trees leaned over the path, and weeds had grown into some sections, making the hike physically challenging. It took about 6 hours to reach the campsite. By the time we arrived, the sun was low in the sky, and shadows were stretching across the clearing. The site itself was unremarkable, just a small patch of grass surrounded by thick trees. But it was private, and that's all I needed. I set my pack down and began assembling the tent while Max did his usual patrol, sniffing around the edge of the clearing. About 15 minutes in, Max returned, but something was off. His tail was down, and he kept glancing into the woods, his body tense. Normally, he would explore freely, but this time he stood close to me, ears perked and eyes fixed on a point deep in the forest. I scanned the area, but everything appeared normal. Still, I trusted Max's instincts. He doesn't act like this without reason. I finished setting up the campfire and kept a careful watch on the woods. As the sun set, darkness swallowed the clearing, and the forest noises became louder, every rustle making me tense. Max stayed close, his gaze never leaving the edge of the trees. About an hour into the night, Max froze completely. His ears pointed straight up, and his body stiffened. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. Then I heard faint snapping of branches and a whisper of movement. I didn't want to panic, but I could feel my heart rate accelerate. I grabbed my flashlight and carefully stepped toward the sound, with Max following closely. 50 feet into the woods, nothing was visible, but Max's behavior told me something was there. We returned to the clearing, and I tried to calm myself, telling myself it could be a deer or some small animal. But deep down, I knew it wasn't ordinary wildlife. The night continued, and Max stayed on high alert, circling the campsite constantly. When we finally went to sleep in the tent, I could sense that something lingered at the edge of the clearing. Around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by Max nudging my face. I had been dreaming, but Max's urgency was real. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent. There, only 10 feet away, a man stood wearing all black, a hoodie covering part of his face, but his eyes and his scraggly beard were visible. He held a small knife, reflecting the light from my flashlight. I froze. Max barked and growled, placing himself between me and the man. The man hesitated, giving me a moment to recover. I grabbed my bear spray, and as I got ready to defend myself, the man suddenly bolted into the darkness of the forest. Max stayed vigilant, but he didn't chase. I packed up everything quickly, keeping Max close, and left the clearing immediately. We made it back to the trail and eventually returned to safety. Even thinking about it now sends chills down my spine. Max was back to normal afterward, but that night reminded me that the wilderness, as beautiful as it is, can hide dangers beyond anything you expect.